Okay, so I don't know how this happened, but a few months ago I realized I now get like a lot of my information from podcasts. And I find that remarkable because podcasts are so young, right? It's been 20 years since the very first podcast. Today on the show, you'll hear how podcasts have reshaped culture. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. Listen, I don't know about you, but for me, I would say that podcasts kind of like snuck up on me in a way. Like at first, I was a casual listener. I listened to one here and there. But at some point in the last year, I realized that podcasts now take up just literally the largest part of my media diet. I listen to more podcasts than I do anything else. And I'm not alone in this. Maybe it's the case for you too. What's amazing is that podcasts are not very old. The very first one was released 20 years ago this month. I wanted to explore how the medium has upended storytelling, upended news and pop culture. Heck, let's just say life as we know it in so many unexpected ways. But at the same time, right, you could say that podcasting is at a bit of a crossroads. There have been significant layoffs and cancellations at major podcasting companies. And right now, as we're talking, there's no clear path forward when it comes to monetizing all of this stuff that you're listening to. So in a moment, you'll hear from someone who follows Canadian podcasts very closely. Kattie Laur is with me in studio now. Katie, hey.
Hi, Elamin.
How's it going?
It's going so good.
I'm so happy that you're here. I want to talk to you in just a moment. But first, I'm going to start with Nicholas Quah, who's the podcast critic for Vulture. He also sits on the Peabody jury. Nick, welcome to Commotion. How's it going?
Going good.
Listen, I want to start with saying your life's work is knowing everything there is to know about podcasts. I am curious, first of all, that's quite a life's work to do. Second of all, what first drew you to that medium?
Well, first of all, I believe my life's work is living well, but it is my job. It's my job to listen to podcasts.
All right. Good. This man has his priorities straight. I love to see it.
What drew me to the medium? Well, the background here is that I grew up in Southeast Asia, in a sort of a country that didn't have much of a tradition of narrative radio, of public radio. When I came to the United States to study for college, I believe it was the local public radio station playing, could have been Radio Live, could have been This American Life, one of those shows, and sort of exposed the entire sort of like narrative tradition to me for the first time. The podcast piece came when I tried to listen to it on demand by myself on my little iPod Shuffle that I still had in 2008, 2009. And in discovering the iTunes sort of podcast directory and realizing there was this entire universe of people making stuff, audio, radio, that I've never heard of before. So the appeal is in that expanse, right?
So let's go back to the very beginning. Here's one of the very first episodes of the very first podcast before even the word itself was coined 20 years ago. Here's Christopher Linden interviewing Jay Rosen, of all people, about blogs.
What's the blog effect on journalism as you see it?
Well, I think the terms of authority are changing. And in the weblog, we see a wholly different way of establishing authority online. There's a kind of meritocracy there where you have to earn your attention. And it's 24 hours, very flexible, very conducive to the individual voice. And all these things are a kind of overturning of the whole system of generating authority that we've seen in journalism for well over 100 years.
First of all, I just have to say, it sounds a little bit like those old Marshall McLuhan clips that people listen to, in the sense that, like, they are still correct, you know? They 100% exactly correct, but also the audio quality makes it sound like 100 years old. They were talking about blogs, you know, not knowing that the podcast medium, the thing they were doing themselves, was about to also upend journalism in its own way. If we're talking about podcasts, Nick, how would you say they change our expectations of what storytelling is and the listening experience?
So that's interesting because the podcast did start out as the audio extension of blogs. And so a lot of the sort of transformative effect is baked into that tradition, which is to say it democratized the means to sort of publication. A lot of folks now can make, basically radio on their own, and that kind of opens up the field of possibility in theory. In practice, it's really hard, like much of the internet. How do you find a 1 in a billion or 1 in a million voice that you kind of want to listen to? But in terms of how it transformed storytelling on the one hand and sort of you kind of radio production on the other, in terms of storytelling, it allowed for longer form, more experimental types of creation because, in traditional radio, you have to fit a certain kind of instant need to meet audiences and to get in front of a ton of listeners and be able to stick in a way that maybe generates enough profit for the corporation or in this case, sort of balancing budget for a public radio station.
Yeah.
But with podcasts, you could experiment in a way that's kind of lower risk off the bat, unless, of course, you're investing tons of money into it, which is the problem that we find ourselves in in the contemporary.
As someone who has listened to a podcast called Taylor Swift Every Album Ever, and each episode is 2 hours long, and they just get into the minutia of each episode, I go, yeah, you can experiment, and you will find your loyal audiences. Maybe not at scale.
I would love that.
But you'll find me, and that's all I really care about. Okay, that leads us to this, by the way.
This is a Global Tel-Link prepaid call from
Adnan Sayed,
an inmate at a Maryland correctional facility.
From This American Life and WBEZ Chicago, it's Serial, one story told week by week. I'm Sarah Koenig.
First of all, I hear that music and I go,
Yes,
oh my
Pavlovian.
God, it's 2014. It's immediately 2014 in my mind. That's, of course, the introduction to Serial. Serial was the very first podcast to top 5 million downloads. It won a Peabody Award the very next year. So it was like this critically acclaimed thing that also proved there's like a real market, right? There's a real market for this kind of content. Tell me what happened to the podcasting industry, and I really mean industry, after Serial came out.
All right, so Serial came out in 2014. That was sort of like right in between when podcast was first created and today. So it was 10 years in. By that time, podcasting had already gone through multiple sort of like, could this be the next big thing? And then the kind of rise and fall cycle.
Yeah.
And by the time already, sort of a lot of other today's sort of well-known podcasters were already making stuff. So Bill Simmons was already making stuff. Mark Maron was already making his interview show. And This American Life had been syndicated and sort of distributed as a podcast for many, many years up until that point. So Serial comes out and it proves a very, very simple experiment on the part of the This American Life staff, which is, can you tell a very long-form story serialized like week after week, which at the time was nobody was doing it because it was an untested idea.
Yeah.
The phenomenon that Serial produced convinced or accelerated what had already been happening, which is we were pretty clear that there was a market for listeners and a market for advertisers. And suddenly when it became such a global sort of phenomenon, everybody wanted cash in. And the money came in the 4 to 5 years right after that.
Yeah, and we should, I guess, give people a scale of the amount of money that came in. 2015, there's about $100 million worth of advertising in podcasting. Mm-hmm. By the time you get to 2021, you're somewhere like near $2 billion. That happens within a span of just 5-6 years of just like this massive explosion. But we are also right now in this period of contraction, right? Like you have all these layoffs happening at Spotify, NPR podcasts also. You've seen a bunch of podcasts being canceled. NPR is pulling back a little bit. Why is that happening now?
Well, it's happening now. So there are two parts to this answer. First is what happened in the past 10 years, essentially a huge influx of, on the one hand, actual genuine long-term investment, but also speculative investment on the part of large music streaming platforms, primarily Spotify, but then also like competitors in iHeartRadio, which is a traditional radio company here in the United States, SiriusXM, which is a satellite radio company all over the world, and Amazon Music. I think you could argue is the sort of fourth player here.
Yeah.
Spotify led the charge, putting in close to $1 billion investment over the subsequent 10 years to put the bet down that they would take charge of this new media industry.
Yeah.
The problem was that a couple of months ago, the market, the sort of larger economic picture turned turbulent for a number of reasons, including rising interest rates, but also just structural sort of cycles.
Yeah.
And suddenly, it's not just in podcasting or the sort of music streaming platforms, but in media at large, suddenly everybody was held to task by investors to also show profits instead of just growth. So a lot of the business models that were still emergent or were still developing, they had to be sort of backbenched. And as a result, they doubled down on the core businesses that they needed to double down on. And that did not include podcasting for a lot of these companies.
Yeah, I guess we should also give people a sense of the fact that, Spotify did put $1 billion into podcasting. About 200 million of that $1 billion went to just Joe Rogan, which is quite wild. Katie can't handle that. Katie, I'm going to come back to you in just a moment on this. But then you kind of get to this reality, right, of it's not just Spotify, but so many other tech companies have been pulling back, have been sort of trying to spend less and less as they sort of maybe try to gear down for what might be a recession. You've been on the record saying 2023 is going to hurt. Why? What do you mean by that?
So we already had a sense going into 2023 that there was going to be some sort of market downturn. Whether there's a recession or not, we don't quite know.
Yeah.
But structurally, these things just happen, and we were overdue for an uptick for quite some time. And there was this sort of general awareness that like when the market does go through this downturn, advertising dollars are going to get tightened because every other company, they're slashing their marketing budgets to stay afloat. And media companies tend to be the most sensitive in this kind of environment. And we see this, like even my parent company, Vox Media, we went through layoffs, Warner Brothers Discovery went through layoffs, Disney went layoffs. Everybody sort of is going through the cycle. So for podcasting specifically, because it's so young as a business and because it was so speculative for a number of years, and a lot of the teams that were built, large teams of 60, 70 people, based on a business model that was not fully fleshed out yet, they were going to get hit. And that was the feeling going into 2023. And now we're almost in July. And that's borne out. We've seen multiple rounds of layoffs, both not just at Spotify, but across the business.
Yeah. So I want to look at the future for a moment by way of an example, because yes, there's been all this turmoil in the industry, but you have genuinely incredible podcasts being made. You're on the Peabody jury. This year, one of our former colleagues right here at CBC, Connie Walker, and her colleagues at Gimlet won a Peabody and the Pulitzer in the same week, I should note, for her deeply personal podcast about her dad's experience of surviving residential school.
In the 1970s, my dad was a police officer in rural Saskatchewan. One night, while out on patrol, he saw a car swerving on the road and he pulled it over. When he walked up to the window, he recognized the man behind the wheel.
As being one of the priests that, and he said, one of the priests that abused him in residential school. And he ended up taking him out of the vehicle and beating the shit out of him.
Nick, you're on the Peabody jury. What did you love about Connie's podcast?
I'll only speak for myself and let my fellow jurors speak for themselves at other avenues. But for me, what was so interesting and fascinating about this project was Connie's blending of the personal and political, right? So first of all, this is a continuation, maybe the apotheosis of a project that she's been doing for a very long time. With the CBC, she made Missing and Murdered, multiple seasons of that show that sort of existed within the same political project of like pushing these stories into light. But this is essentially a personal history in addition to being a larger political investigation or a journalistic investigation about these schools. And that combination is something that she could only tell. Only this person, only this story could tell. Yeah, it was very powerful.
Yeah, I think the word singular comes to mind. Like that's that's what I think of when I think of Connie's podcast making. What does it suggest to you about the future of the medium that a podcast like Connie's is being recognized with both a Pulitzer and a Peabody?
I think the sort of awards recognition illustrates more of the present than the future, in the sense of the good stuff was always here, and it just feels like the sort of award structure, whether it's the Pulitzers or whether it's sort of any other kind of awards, we're finally catching that. Those structures are finally catching up. But the question about the future is, can good stuff like this, really, really high quality work that's award winning, is that enough to encourage the production and creation of more stuff at a high level? And that tension, I think, is something that's going to be quite interesting to sort of watch moving forward.
Whew, that is a big question. If you're just joining us, my name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and you're listening to Commotion. I'm speaking with Nick Quah, the podcast critic for Vulture, who also sits on the Peabody jury. This is a good moment to bring in the other voice that's been around the table now. Kattie Laur, my apologies, runs Pod the North, a newsletter about podcasting in Canada. How's it going, Katie?
It's going really well. I'm excited to be here.
Of course. Listen, we've been talking about Connie's podcast and how much of an impact it has made. That's pretty incredible. We're also marking 20 years this month since the very first podcast came out and how that medium has changed. You've listened to what Nick has had to say about the overall state of podcasting. When you think about Connie's story, when you think about the success of that podcast, what does that tell you about the success that we're capable of in this country?
That's such a hard question for me to answer because there's just so many good stories here. And I think it's kind of sad that Connie had to go to the States to tell that story. But it just tells me that there's just so much great content here that is just kind of itching the surface of the podcasting industry that needs to get out there.
I was going to say, like, you mentioned this because a lot of Canadians end up leaving to work for American companies in order to make the podcast that they want to make. Actually, a lot of Canadians end up working for American companies while not even leaving the country. What kind of changes do you want to see made to the way that we sort of take care of our podcasters?
There are a number of changes that I want to see made. I think I started the newsletter because I felt that the industry in Canada was just so fractured. There was sort of network productions happening. There was freelancers kind of running around trying to meet everybody and get a break and make some money. Yeah. And then there's like a huge skew of indie podcasters out there that are just trying to have fun, make a little bit of money about it.
Sure.
And when I came in, I was kind of like, nobody knows who each other is. I was emailing kind of everyone across the board because I identify as a indie producer, a freelance producer, and a network producer. Yeah. And it was really hard for me to make connections still. So that's kind of what I'm noticing, is that everyone sort of seems fractured here.
Well, I think what you're getting at is sort of a larger question, right? This larger question of, do we take this seriously as an industry in this country? Because, you know what, there are there's media reporters. You know, how closely do they cover podcasting in this country? Yeah. And you sort of maybe saw a gap in terms of just like the weight with which we treat podcasting in this country, hey?
Yeah, there's definitely a lack of anyone talking about it here, other than if you're like within the industry and sort of talking to your 5 people that you know and work with all the time. Yeah. But I also think there's a culture within Canada that is just generally risk averse. And when you compare it to what Nick was talking about with what's going on in the States and how massive the podcasting industry there is, in Canada, it's not like that at all. We seem to be very, very small, tight-knit teams. We really have like kind of a couple of hubs. We have our hub in Toronto with lots of podcasters, a hub in Vancouver that's a little smaller, and then we've kind of got our hub of French language podcasts in Quebec. But that's kind of all that we've got going for us, and nobody knows each other.
Nobody knows each other, but also this larger question of like nobody knows where the industry's headed to, right? Like, it can be in a smaller market like Canada, it can be a little bit difficult to sort of scale your podcast in a way. Listen, it's hard to make any predictions. Things are changing so fast, but I'm going to put each of you on the spot. Nicholas, 5 years from now, what's the biggest shift going to be? Are we all going to be just watching our podcast on YouTube? Is that the plan?
I think in 5 years, everybody will be underwater. So I think all of this will be rendered developed.
Wow. Well, that's something.
Well, in 5 years, who knows? We're going through, again, it's not just podcasting. We're going through a radical reconstruction, reimagining of the sort of broader entertainment industry. We don't quite know what the world's going to look like in entertainment after the writer's strike. Yeah. But I do feel that the growth of the quote unquote creator economy, that's still the wind that's pushing a good chunk of the segment of the podcast sort of community moving forward. Yeah. On the one hand, some of them will be on video. On the one hand, some folks just don't want to be on video. And a world in the future that can accommodate both kinds of creators is one that I hope to see. I don't know how that sort of composition will work out.
If I can just push you a little bit further on this, it seems like, Spotify or Amazon or even Apple, they're sort of in a race to become the YouTube of podcasting. But it might be the case that YouTube is the YouTube of podcasting, right?
Exactly.
That is sort of the challenge that they're being presented with here.
It's kind of also the bizarre nature of the story because they're racing to the past. They're racing to the present, right? It's not really anything particularly new. They are trying to be another existing company, right? Which is kind of funny because we started out going, this is actually the future of radio, not having to be on camera, it's a big part of it.
Yeah, exactly. We keep sort of inventing things that we've already invented before, which is pretty remarkable. Katie, what do you think?
Right.
I mean, Spotify is trying to be the TikTok of podcasting right now, right? We can swipe through and get little glances at different podcasts. Yeah. But I also kind of I would hope that podcasting moves in the direction of kind of the niches that exist and the industries and like verticals that they exist within. I think podcasting will hopefully be a big part of creating more transparent spaces around, finance or travel, whatever it might be, and open up spaces for people to have larger conversations on like a more, popular kind of place. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, it totally makes sense. But there's a sense of like, what does it look like as this industry matures? Because again, 20 years, that's really not an old industry at all. Mm-hmm. I'm going to put each of you on the spot in the couple of minutes we have left here. I'd love to ask you about a podcast that you're loving right now, Nicholas.
Oh, for me, so it's a podcast that I've loved since it started coming out in the early pandemic. It's a show called Time to Say Goodbye. These days, it's hosted by just 2 people, Tammy Kim and Jay Kang, 2 writers here in the United States. And the show principally tackles like Asian American issues from a broadly leftist perspective, but generally just kind of a community building vessel. And they're kind of saucy, they're kind of spicy, and I kind of love hearing what they have to say about various issues that hits the Asian American diaspora or the Asian diaspora at large.
I love that because like there's something about that gets at the intimacy of podcasts, right? The way they sort of can speak within a community. We have a clip from that podcast. Let's just play it right now.
Hello, welcome to Time to Say Goodbye. And it's just me and Tammy this week. Tammy, how are you doing?
Hey, Jay. I'm doing really good. We had our picnic. We missed you. Yeah, we had several dozen people, listeners, come out with their friends and family. It was great. We had people from Texas, New Jersey. It was awesome. It was a perfect Asian American summer camp vibe.
That sounds like a delight. I want to go to that camp. That sounds fantastic.
Same.
All right. Katie, same question to you. Favorite Canadian podcast right now?
Let's Make a Rom-Com stuck with me forever, I think.
Hey.
It's just like I consider it a totally new version of an investigative podcast. Yeah. Instead of following how someone, was murdered, you're following how someone creates a story and 3 comedians that are hilarious. And then you get the ending. You get the full picture with the read-through at the end. And it's just so well produced, and I'm a big fan.
Let's hear a bit of it.
Love is cheesy.
She's a firefighter. He's an arsonist. Will they, won't they, put out the fire of their hearts?
It's so good.
I'd watch that.
I love...
I'm waiting for the movie.
I'm absolutely ready for that movie. I think that's a perfect note to leave it here. Katie, Nick, thank you so much for being here to chat about the future of podcasting, this beautiful, mysterious thing that we all get to do for a living, which is great. It's a wonderful time. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nick Quah is a podcast critic for New York Magazine's Vulture. He also sits on the Peabody jury. He was in Boise, Idaho. Kattie Laur runs Pod the North. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud. You're listening to Commotion. All right, before I go, I just wanted to play a bit of new music. I genuinely just love a good cover. I have too many cover songs on my phone. That's just what I'm about. Don't you? This one is incredible. This is Elisapie covering Metallica's The Unforgiven.
Non amorto che salir soni aneati talerto malito sosi ni paito ler soni nama
My God, that is Elisapie with a beautiful cover of Metallica's song, The Unforgiven, sung in Inuktitut. It's called Isomaji Yunangituk, and a big congratulations goes out to Elisapie. Last week, Elisapie received an honorary degree from Concordia University in Montreal for their Inuktitut artistry and activism. That is it for the show today. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. It's been a pleasure being with you today. I'm going to be here tomorrow. Hope to see you then.